Hello.
Hello.
Oh, they're starting to bring in some food, so it's okay if you're distracted. I would be distracted with food as well. So some of you are familiar faces, but I'll just take a minute to introduce myself. I have my own practice in Lawrence, Kansas, Tillery Time Counseling. I'm really big about communication in life, workplace. It really has such an impact on how we do life. So Angela was nice enough to put this contact information together. So normally I do a bigger presentation for the K.DBE services. So if there's any questions that aren't answered, you have things pop up, please feel free to reach out to me. Call, email, happy to be of any help to you guys. So why does anybody think we're even talking about communication? Why is this a big deal? Why is this a topic even?
It's the only way to get things done.
Okay, so to get things accomplished. Anybody else have anything else? Okay, all right, you guys are a lively crowd, so I'm gonna roll with it. So that's right, so the communication, if we didn't have communication, thinking of how much more difficult it would be to achieve the goals that we set out, especially as business owners, when we're talking to employees, when we're looking at growing our business, when we're looking at networking, what we do if we didn't have communication. So this is a big piece as to why it's important and we're even talking about it. So I'm gonna have Angela hand these out. I won't really touch on these. Those of you that are familiar faces to me, we went through this a little more intensely, fine-tooth comb. These are SMART goals. So when we talk about, this is a SMART goal worksheet. So when we talk about communication, we're trying to get stuff done. It's really good to know what our goal is that we want to get done and what we want to be communicating. So this is a worksheet that is commonly used in a lot of areas. So if you pause, think about, so if I'm getting ready to have an employee meeting, what's my goal? What do I want to do? What do I want to accomplish? So this is a little more in depth where it actually causes you to sit down and really kind of go step by step on some of these things. So I just wanted to at least make sure you guys have that information. So I can get really caught up in what I talk about, so I always have to give myself notes. So when we think about communicating, we've got a goal of wanting to get things done. So then we want to think about who's our audience, who are we talking to? So when you guys thought about coming today, one, I'm guessing the food was a pretty good draw. Angela's a pretty awesome draw too. You know, when you're thinking about the communication, trying to get something accomplished, who are you guys really communicating with in your work? Who do you see as your primary people you're trying to talk to?
Employees, subs, owners, people we work for.
Yeah. Okay, good. Does anybody else have, or did he kind of cover it? He usually covers a lot pretty well. Huh?
Permitting, regulatory companies.
Oh, yeah. That can be a tough one. Yeah. Frustrating maybe at times, I'm going to guess. Yeah. We're going to get to the whole frustrating getting hijacked thing a little bit later.
Well, I guess I think I was going to say the same thing, basically. Internal and external customers. It can be from lenders. It can be from people who do your finances, the regulatory people, and also the people that directly report to you. So it could be internal and external as well.
Yeah. That's a really good point. So that's what's so interesting when we're a business owner. So I own my own business. I work for myself. So I'm communicating to a lot of different people. And so I have to have the context of who I'm communicating to, and once again, what's my goal? What's the purpose of this?
Can I say, it's
Sure.
really interesting because last night we were in another class and they talked on the same similar topic. And they talked about how to listen to employees, take time, always take time, award, recognize, and those kinds of things. And you know, it just all sort of ties in with where you're going with this right now.
You're stealing my whole presentation.
Way to go.
But the good news is we don't always retain everything we hear, which
Now
this other handout. So as Angela's passing that out, what feedback have you guys gotten, even when you're outside the work? So maybe kids, spouses, friends, family members. How do you communicate? Do people say, wow, I really understood what you said? Does there seem to be confusion? They think you're really abrupt? And what do you guys notice about your own communication style? Or maybe it's easier to notice others. Sometimes that's easier. You got.
You know, just today I have a new staff and I was giving her an assignment. And I tend to talk fast.
No.
And I'm going to give you direct details with expectations. So when I got through with her, I said, okay, now, I know I've said a lot of information and I've asked you to do several different things and I was talking very fast. Tell me what you think you heard me say.
And what did you notice when you paused to do that?
She was quiet for a minute. She said, I got it. And then she told me exactly what I did. And I said, you're good. She's very new. And it was something, it's a task she's never done. And I gave her some, but I do talk fast. And I am direct, not quite as direct as this one. But I am direct and I do talk fast. And you know, and I find myself, what I find myself is sometimes I'm not really patient and stop to think about who I'm talking to. So I'm going to go boom, 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 when sometimes people need me to just breathe and let them digest a piece of it. But I've learned to say now, and recognize those pieces and says, do you understand? Tell me what you thought you heard me say. With my kids, my grandkids, definitely with my husband if he's a honey-do-list. And then, of course, sometimes with my staff. Now, what my staff has learned to do is, because I'm a visionary, okay, I have this idea, and they automatically go grab a pen and piece of paper, because they know they're going to start writing down.
So I want to say I appreciate you mentioning the breath. You take a breath,
Yeah.
take a pause. Were you going to say something? No? Did you take a breath before you talk? So how did you learn that was your communication style?
By everybody saying, I understand, I don't know what you said, or I didn't hear that, or pieces missing, or end result not being what I wanted.
But sometimes you talk and it's hard to keep up with you, like you said.
It is.
And you're taking notes, and it's hard. I'm not a visionary like she is. She, like the first construction career expo, she knew what she wanted. She had it all in her head, and I had no idea how this was going to go. So it's hard for me to catch up with her because that's just not who I am. Being her employee, just saying.
We might touch on something later that might be helpful to you. Maybe. Does anybody else know about their communication style or how they've figured out their communication style?
Well, I know a fallacy in mine, and that is, I do have a fallacy. I've never really taken the time to deal with the chain of command, if you will, the field guy.
Are you kidding me?
Huh?
Are you kidding me?
Well, yeah, I'm telling you. Because I try to value my time, and I say my time is more valuable being here and other places than it is to hear your complaints about what's going on out there in the field, and take that to somebody else. But the first day of this other class we were in, and they talked about a business model from the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire sent the army out there to go out and fight, and they set up on the mountaintop looking down at the army, and hopefully their things were communicated, and it sometimes is not. Yet that guy on the front line could tell you some things that's going on that you don't see up there on that mountain. And so now I'm trying to understand that level of communication is more important than what it used to be to me.
And I think when you talk about communication with employees, there's kind of a trust piece. I'm going to guess some of us have been in some job at some point where the culture was there are certain things you don't talk about, or kind of the CYA. So we'll talk a little bit about not only the communication across how do we start to recognize things in other people, how can we recognize our communication, and then also how do we get that as part of our culture and our businesses that we do. So, so let's talk about how many different ways we communicate. So we have verbal, written, and nonverbal. Verbal, this was a statistic, 7% of our communication is verbal, and then 38% is paraverbal, so it's how we say it, our tone. Then the nonverbal, through our expressions and actions, is 55%. So it really makes sense that people, the handout that Angela just gave you, that 20% of what we hear is what we remember. And if you look at that sheet she handed out, it even breaks it down even more, which I'll touch on just a little bit. But at the very bottom it says, we remember 95% of what we teach to others. So that's a pretty big gap in what we remember and how we remember. And it even breaks it down more on that handout that Angela gave you. So when we talk about the communication we're having with internal or external, we're looking to getting permits, we're looking at subcontractors, we're looking at networking, we're looking at our employees, we're looking at all of these things. What do you guys notice about how you present yourself when you're not just thinking about what you're saying? How are you presenting yourself, your body language, or what do you notice other people present that you have a reaction to? And maybe you don't. Maybe you don't notice that. Do you notice?
Well, I have an employee who will not look you in the eyes when they're talking to you. They're always looking more off to the side. Took a long time to learn to trust an employee to get things done the right way. It was just nonverbal mistrust from the very start.
Yeah.
And, you know, after a while working with her, she's probably the best employee I have.
Yeah. That's a really good one, the eye contact, because in our culture here in America, we're taught eye contact is a very important thing, and there's lots of other cultures where that's a disrespectful. So it's really variant. So the context is really important, but it's also noticing how you're reacting, because since we all have different subcultures here in America, there's a pretty broad one that we can follow. So no eye contact is often going to be seen, or very limited eye contact is often going to be seen as something distrustful.
A lot of companies and a lot of sales training and professional development courses used to involve role play, and over the years many have gotten away from role play because of the angst associated with it, and people didn't want to be videotaped and didn't want to be viewed or to be judged. But one of the things that role play allowed you to do is to see how you interact or what your body language is during a role play situation. And oftentimes people don't realize that they may be slumped in a chair, or they may have a nervous twitch or whatever. But I mean, so when people backed off of the role play, they lost a very important element as it pertains to understanding your communication style, because oftentimes things we do and how we react and how we slump and how we show that we don't care about posture, that says just as much as what you're saying verbally. Mm-hmm. And maybe one of the things we can go back to, or companies can go back to, if they're talking about communication styles, especially people that are in a revenue generating position, is to go back and do role play so they can see how they look to others, because what you think about yourself is not as important as what others think of what they're listening to you.
Wow.
So,
But don't you think that also is going to vary with the age difference in the generation? We've got a multi-generation workforce.
yes.
And these young ones view and see communication a lot different, and they do it a lot different.
Yeah.
Yes. One thing something you touched on is obviously written communication.
Mm-hmm.
The art of writing a letter or even drafting an email, to her point, has changed dramatically.
Yeah.
My kids can be downstairs, and I can be upstairs, and instead of coming up to talk to me, they text me. You know,
Yeah.
or they could be sitting on the couch and they'll text me while I'm sitting on the couch, and I'll look at them and go, really? They're like, what? I'm like, I'm right here. So to your point, communication is, amongst generations, is changing dramatically.
Yeah.
And you know, I think it's important for business owners to understand how the younger generation does communicate. Kind of going back to your point of the eye contact, we have a whole new generation that's, you know, they're using computers in schools now.
Yeah.
You know, they're submitting their assignments online. They don't. My kids don't bring. I mean, I don't think I've seen my, you know, paper. I don't think I have paper laying around my house because everything is electronic now. I mean, so it's not only, you know, it's how they're being taught that's changing the way we communicate, not just communication in general.
And if a computer breaks, Google goes away, and Siri don't answer a question, what kind of skills do they have when it comes to survival?
Yeah.
It's scary, because they're very tied to technology.
My kids would tell you they have me. Just ask my dad.
You're the go-to.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I know it all.
Well, and you know, when you bring that up, a couple of things. One is, you know, how do you allow your employees to communicate with you? Is it only via email? Is it a phone call? Is it text? If they're going to be sick, how can they let you know that? How do you communicate with your external customers or the people you're trying to get permits from? Is that a lot via phone? I'm going to guess a lot of you guys have heard, you know, smile on the phone, they can hear it on the other end. And it's so very true. When I'm in a really crappy mood and I call someone, usually someone's calling me back going, what's going on today? But when I'm smiling, having a good day, they're picking up on that tone. So a question for you, when you got the text from your kiddo, what was your response? What did you notice your response to be?
You know, when it first started, you know, depending on what the situation is, my kids, I try to be very consistent with them on what the expectations are and what, you know, repercussions for, you know, misbehaving is. But when they first started texting me, when, you know, honestly, it was kind of one of those things where it's like, when I was their age, how did we do it? And it may have been me. You know, I can recall yelling, "Mom," you know, for my mom to come see me, as opposed to going, you know, she'd always say, "No, when you need to talk to me, you come find me." And so, you know, I reply back and be like, "I don't think I understand your question. I'm gonna need you to come discuss this with me," so that then they know they have it. So, you know, they know now when I ask that question, I can't just text them. I have to go.
So that's a really great example where our communication style doesn't just stop at work. So when we talk about communication here today, it's communication throughout all the sectors of our life. So that's a really good example of when an employee or whoever we're trying to communicate isn't communicating in the pathway that we receive the best. That's a great way to intervene and say, I'm not sure I'm quite understanding what you're saying. We either need to talk or can you send me an email about that? So as you become more aware of your own communication style, know how you receive information the best. And then that's a good segue to get the information in a way that's most helpful to you. So one of the things, have you guys ever seen 40-Year-Old Virgin? Okay, do you remember the dating advice that is given to the main character when he meets the girl in the electronics store? Do you remember the advice his friends gave him?
Yes.
Doesn't he ask everything with a question?
Yes.
Or something like that?
Yep. If she asks you a question, you answer with a question.
Answer everything with a question.
Yeah. So a good thing to kind of keep that in the back of your mind, and we'll do a little experiment a little bit later, but so you guys can really feel what this is like. But oftentimes we don't know the context. So if we start to notice something come up with us, so like the no eye contact, I don't know, that tells me she's not trustworthy. You know, start to ask some questions around some things. Questions, you know, like I tell people, put on your little private investigator hat and you just ask questions so you get the context, because there's so much that goes into communication and communication style and who we are. So I reference that now when I thought of that line a while back, because it really makes sense. Put on your question cap and start to ask around. Things that aren't clarifying, you might notice you get extremely angry or upset or something like that. Go to question mode and see what you find out. You might be surprised what happens with you internally and with your mood, and you might be interested in how that conversation changes. Another piece of that too is if you talk to people, a lot of times, not all the time, but a lot of times if you ask people questions, they feel really validated. They feel like you're invested, you're interested, you want to know what's going on with them. And when you look at employer-employee relations, that goes a long way, a long way.
But I think it also depends on the type of question you ask.
Correct.
I have a boss who, when he asks you a question, it's almost as if, you know, I'm asking you a question, and if you don't know the answer, then you're obviously not the smartest person in the world. But I'm asking it basically to set you up to then say the next thing I want to say, which is also not very uplifting.
Well, and that's, yeah, so that's a really good point. So when I'm talking about the question piece, you know, that's a really good clarification, is we're talking about like what kind of culture do we want to have in our work environment? Do we want to have employees that are responsive? Do we want to have employees that feel invested in what we're doing? Our external customers, do we want them on board that we want to get this building built, or we need to get this truck running so we can get stuff hauled, or we need to get the phone lines in so we can make these communications? So when you're invested in people, they're going to invest in you. So it's that communication piece of what's the point of communication? It's because we want to get something done. We want that goal. So there is logistical questions where it's like, you better have the answer, you better have it now. When you're looking at relationship and building those, when you ask people questions and get clarification and start to invest in them, you're going to find that return a large part of the time. So moving into the language part. So there are three kind of things that really alert me when people use language. One is whys. So when you frame a question, if you frame it starting with a why, do you guys notice what happens when people ask you, why did you do that? Why were you late today? Why isn't the car running? Do you guys notice what your reactions are when I start with a why?
It's defensive.
Yeah. And what does that tend to do with communication?
Break it down.
Yeah. So when you're thinking about asking those questions, see if there's a way to formulate it differently from a why to a what, or a how, or something different than a why. That's going to really help the communication stay open and progress in a way. The other one's shoulda, coulda, woulda. So the kind of joke that we have about shoulds is don't should on yourself. When you use the word should, it's a really shaming word. So I don't know if you can think about when you do your own internal language, you think, oh man, I should have turned left instead of turning right. The traffic was better going left instead of right. You know, notice what that does to you. And know that that's what it does to other people as well. So if there's a way to reframe of, well, you can next time, trying to remove the should out of the language, and you might be surprised how much you actually use it when you pay attention to it. The other piece that I've noticed, the other phrase is the have to. People oftentimes, when have to is a big part of the language and the words, there tends to be a stuckness with it. People tend to get exhausted, more tired, less motivation because I've got to do this. And then procrastination can set in. So then when you're looking at employees, you're like, well, why didn't you get it done? This was a have to, you've got to get it done. So sometimes if you change that phrase language, the have to, into I want, I can, I'm able to, I would like you to, you might find you might lift the energy or the culture that you're going for just a little bit. And these are just like 3 examples of little changes. You're not having to write any bylaws or processes or anything like that. Just paying attention and noticing how often you use these. What are your responses to them? And just do a trial run, see what you notice. Also, another piece is when you make a mistake, so say you're not nice to a person one day, or your how you're interacting with someone is negative. The quicker you repair the relationship, the less likely it is to stay in the long-term memory. So why do you guys think that would be important?
Why is it important that someone not have a bad taste in the mouth about you for any longer than necessary?
Well, so it doesn't stay in the long-term memory, right? Why is it even important that it's not in the long-term memory? Why do we care about that?
Because then if it's in the long-term memory, the next time you communicate efficiently, or the next time you come across as coarse, or whatever the case might be, they're going to recall the other times, and it's going to build up.
Yeah. And then what does that feel like when someone goes, oh man, he was the guy that said this and this and this and wasn't nice? What do you notice how people respond to that? That's the story.
Communication breaks down.
Yeah. So the quicker you repair, so we're all going to make mistakes. We're all human. It's part of being here. Know that the repair is possible, and the shorter amount of time it takes for you to move into that repair phase, the less likely they're going to have that bad story that's going to follow you around and then break down the communication.
Then bad experiences tend to get shared more often than good experiences.
That's a really good point.
It's not just the fact that that person has a bad taste in their mouth. When somebody else asks that person about the other person, they're going to say, oh man, they're, this and this and this happened, and that. So
Yeah.
yet another reason why you want to fix that sooner than later, because you don't want negativity to spread.
Yeah.
Negativity is very contagious.
Yes. And I'll talk a little bit about the brain stuff. I get so caught up in this. But when you talk about that, the neurons that fire together in our brain wire together. So if we've got a negative image representation of a person, that's all that's going to come in. If we wake up in a cranky mood and the car didn't start, well, then we're like, oh, nothing ever works in my life. Nothing ever comes together. That's what we're going to see, because our neurons in our brain that fire, they wire together. And that's why they talk about there is some validity in having a positive mindset. As a therapist, there's a whole other layer to that. So I don't want you to walk out of here saying, if I'm positive, life's going to be great. But it definitely does have a play on the brain that we know now about the wiring and how that works. The other piece about language, so you guys had talked about like the texting, emailing, like we have a lot more technology out there. So what I really like to use, because I'm a very direct communicator, especially when I'm in an email, I'm like, I need this, this, and this. Okay, let's get it done. Let's do that. As a therapist, I really have to tone that down a bit. But when you're communicating with people, a good way to frame that is to pause, write the email out, write the text out of your need, and then frame it in a happy sandwich. Has anybody ever heard of the happy sandwich? Who wants to share the happy sandwich? I thought I saw some yeses. No? So the happy sandwich is you start off good, complimentary, something positive. You get in the meat, so it's either a need or it's something you need corrective action on, something that isn't so fluffy and lovely. And then you end on something positive. And so what you tend to do with that when you can do that is you've got some people buying in that you've, taken some time to kind of put that together. You know it's a hard topic, or maybe you don't want to ruin a relationship even though you need to address whatever it is. So always think the happy sandwich. Good, get the meat, good. So when you're looking at some of that other form of communication, and it even helps with talking, but I find oftentimes when we're talking, it's really hard to automatically think of the happy sandwich. When we're typing stuff out, we have a pause we can take. So, so the listening part, how are we doing on time? I feel like
We're doing good.
Okay, all right. So the listening part, how many of you guys have heard about reflective listening? Okay, there's a few heads. Does anybody want to volunteer to say what they think about reflective listening to be, or what they understand it to be? Mm-hmm. You gonna go for it?
Yeah.
Okay.
You're basically playing back what you've heard. So in other words, what I hear you saying is, we need to do a better job at doing the following. So that shows you that I understand what you're communicating. And if I reflect back incorrectly, then you have the opportunity to get me back on track.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. There's so many benefits to it. So then the question is, why doesn't everybody do it or know about it? Well, one, it takes time. So when you're in small business, time is money, right? You want things to move along fast, you want efficiency, you want to get things done. Hence probably why you've got your communication style. You got these kids you got to move around, you got your husband that needs to be doing stuff, you got stuff you got to get done at work. If we pause enough to do some of that reflective listening, especially if it's something that's very important at work, perhaps a big project, perhaps we're working on a contract trying to get a permit, if we pause long enough to do that reflective listening, one, we already start addressing if there's any miscommunications right then and there so we don't snowball and we're at the end of a project and we're like, what were you doing over here? The other thing is it brings up validation. I know you heard me, and that's important. People like to be heard. You feel validated. You feel you're part of the process. So one of the examples I like to give, so if someone says, I need some more time, what do you guys assume someone's saying? Mm-hmm.
Or they don't have enough information in order to make a decision.
They haven't done what they were supposed to.
There's one interpretation. So all of the feedback, you guys assumed I was talking about T-I-M-E. But there's T-H-Y-M-E. Yeah. So it's that kind of, that's a pretty extreme example, but it's those little pieces that get missed. Like when people say, I don't know what to do about it. Well, what's the it? Tell me about the it. I want to know that. So that way we're on the same page and we're communicating. Multitasking, once again, that is a very sought after and appreciated skill in our society, and also once again as a small business owner. I can't tell you how many different hats I wear throughout the day doing all these different things. But when the communication piece is involved, it's really important to breathe, step aside, and be engaged, especially around the culture you want to create in your business, or when you're also doing external customers and you're networking. The multitasking, I can tell you if someone's looking at their phone and I'm like at a networking event and they're flipping through, I'm going to go find somebody else to talk to. I'm going to find somebody else that's going to engage me a little bit differently. So just be aware, and also recognizing there's a balance in all of this. Like, we all know what it's like to be small business owners. We all know what it's like to work within a small business or where we wear multiple hats. So this is not where we're going to do this 100% of the time, and if I don't, then I'm not getting it right. It's about being aware and making shifts when you can, and being aware of the culture you're creating around you. And also remembering the reflective listening is really good. On that handout, the 20%, we only remember 20% of what we hear. So that's a really big point when we talk about reflective listening. We're telling people, or people are telling us to do things. Well, are we using that reflective listening to make sure that we're maybe above the curve on that 20%? And the other interesting piece about that handout is the 95%. We remember what we teach. Once again, this is a little out of scope of today, but maybe that plays into who do you put in leadership positions? You know, if they're going to remember that stuff, can you shift them into a leadership position and they're going to remember more of the stuff? And then it can filter down in a more efficient way. Here's another. Does anybody have any kids that have gone off to college or getting ready to go off to college or remembers going off to college? Okay. So when you think about your kid going off to college, what's kind of the first thoughts you have about?
Well, luckily, they're almost done.
Okay. Do you remember what you thought when they were going off to college?
Soon they'll make their own money.
Yeah?
I just worried. I mean, you know, they would be on their own and independent for the first time.
Yeah.
Semi-independent, I should say.
So kind of like two different perspectives there a little bit, like go start earning your own way. I'm tired of paying all the stuff, right? And then the other one kind of like you are learning your own way. Okay, let's do this. I'm paying attention to the hiccups you might have. And then it sounded like you were noticing where they're almost done. You were kind of a little excited about that. Yeah. And so the perspective on that, that's what changes when we talk about communication, is it's all about perspective. So I would suspect some of the college kids might be like, whoa, no parents, I'm so excited. And then maybe there's a younger sibling that's like, oh, I finally get my own room, I don't have to deal with my older sibling, done and out, yay. Same event, different perspectives. So know that also with communication, the perspective becomes a piece of it too. Thanks. So what do you do when the conversation goes south? What do you do when people aren't responsive, they're getting angry, you're not responding? So what are some things that you do? So first of all, how do you guys know when you start to shut down on a conversation or when somebody else starts to shut down? What do you pay attention to or notice?
My tone.
What happens with your tone?
As my kids would say, it sounds like I'm yelling, or I am yelling at them without yelling.
Oh, that's a technique. That's a skill. That is good.
A lot of times it's just body language, you can read it in their demeanor.
When I find myself getting stretched, I take a breath. That means I'm frustrated because they're challenging me, staff-wise, I'm talking about. I'll take a breath, then I'll kind of say, okay, let me look out the window. I'll look at, I take a breath. Oh, you should see it. And then,
I'm a witness.
I've seen it a couple times.
I'll take a window.
And she'll look out the window and I'm thinking, this can't be good. And then she'll look back at you.
And I say, okay, you're really stretching me. I refuse to be stressed, but I'm being stretched and I don't want to pop.
Mm.
And then I may take another breath. And say, how do I say this? Yes. But, yeah.
Well, I'm a reactionist, and I probably should learn that breath technique.
I do some workshops on that. I'm just saying.
You know, whatever's going on right then, and we're gonna deal with it right then, and I'm done with it. And I'm not saying that's the best approach. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying what it has been. I am trying to mature at this old age in my life. I'm trying to get a little better at this, but I've always been a reactionist, and we're gonna deal with this right here. We're gonna be done with it, and we're gonna move on because now I got something else I want to go do, and it doesn't include this. And so, it's probably not the smartest technique. I'm sort of aware of that now, but that's just the way it's been.
How did you become aware that that might not be the smartest technique?
Actually, it wasn't from the conversations with whomever that person might have been. It was just over a period of time I have matured, I've slowed down, listened, and I've questioned myself. And so I'm one of those people that think about past things. And I says, boy, I could have dealt with that differently. And it's long gone now, but and then when I come to places like this and I get these affirmations, I've been sitting here since you've been talking, thinking about some bad and some good situations. And I would like to think that I'm going to be there yet, a better person as a result of some of the things that I've learned and experienced through this kind of dialogue.
Yeah. I firmly believe, and I move through life in such a way that I believe we're all a work in progress. Anybody that ever gets it right all the time, you should probably be a little cautious about that, if that's what they're putting out there, because I haven't met anybody yet. It's part of being human. Yeah. Actually, I do, no. So what we know now, so this is where I get a little bit into the brain science piece so we can kind of understand a little bit what really happens. And it's not just about trying to teach to read. This is also what happens to any of us. So there are two language parts of our brain that when we are triggered, and so what do I mean by triggered? Triggered means, I call it going offline. So we're in that anger state, we're reactionary, we're not thinking things through. The language part of our brain actually goes offline. So our ability to communicate it is like at its lowest, right? So when you're talking about, I want to get in there and get it done, and I'm learning that hasn't worked so well maybe sometimes, or I could have done it different, the language part of your brain probably wasn't working at its best. So know if you feel that you're getting hijacked, I call it going offline. I have a 24-hour rule. Wait 24 hours, then respond. Let the brain language come back online. Yeah, maybe 10 minutes. Maybe we start with 10 minutes. Did you have something? Five.
I was just saying technology, that's one place where technology has helped me tremendously. Because when I get an email and the tone of the email takes me to that place, I will type out what I want to say in that moment. And then you want to walk away. And then I usually come back, completely delete it and start over.
Really?
Or if I think I was, if I think I was stating facts, I will have someone read it and go,
Yeah.
read this and give me some tips to put it in a way so it doesn't come across as I'm being a reactionary smart.
Yeah.
But obviously when you're talking to someone in person, sometimes I have learned when someone gets to that point, I say, at this point, anything I say isn't going to be productive. I've heard what you've said. Give me some time to consider that, and I'll get back to you.
Yeah.
I'm ready to give you an answer that is productive as opposed to what I'm thinking right now, because that's not going to help either one of us move forward. So.
Yeah.
I mean, don't you think our communication is going to also, and how we handle things are going to vary based on our attitude or where we are?
Tell me more.
Well, because there are times that if I'm really busy and on some short timelines and need to get through, I don't feel like I have a lot of patience with a lot of empty communication, unnecessary questions. If you're given a command, you need to do it. When other times, if I tell you to do something or say something needs to be done, and there could be extra communication, and I'm just really patient, and then when you get through, of course, it has to be done. But at least I allow you to air it and share it more.
Mm-hmm.
So I think how we handle communication and even some of the challenges is based on where we are with ourselves and what's going on around us that day.
That is very true.
At least it is with me.
That is very, very
Sometimes
true.
I have to stop and think, or they say, "Oh, I'm sorry, were you busy?" I stopped saying no, I wasn't, because I was. And I say, yeah, but it's okay, let me get my mind together for a few minutes, or give me 5 minutes and come back and see me, or something like that. Because otherwise, it could be short, and maybe not always real good.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not always that the answers are changed or the words have changed, but the tone and all the other pieces. Because I probably communicate, well, I know I do, more non-verbally than I ever do verbally.
Mm-hmm.
You're gonna get that.
I just saw that nonverbal right now. I just want to point that out.
But don't you think that sometimes hurts that person who's trying to rush in your office and speak to you about something, and you deflated them by saying, even though your rationale way of looking at it was great, because you need to deflate for 2 or 3 minutes before we proceed with this conversation. But I ran in your office and I wanted to convey this and I wanted to say this, and you just deflated me by saying, give me 5 minutes, give me 2 minutes. And so if I don't get it, this kind of person I don't get it off right then the way I think what I mean or what I feel, then it loses the flavor, because now I'm going back, I'm in my corner and I'm thinking and I'm rationalizing how I should say it and what I should do, the way I was going to say it is not right, and so it doesn't have the same impact or flavor when I come back 5 minutes later.
Yeah, but to her point, I know for me, if I'm in the middle of doing something, or if maybe I'm typing an email, maybe I'm working on something, and you come in, and I can tell that what you need to say is important. Mm-hmm. If I try to handle it right then while I'm still thinking about what I'm typing, no matter how you convey it to me, it's not going to come across the way you want.
How do you communicate that?
What I normally tell people in that situation is, I see that what you need to tell me is super important. I have to finish what I'm doing, not trying to take away with what you're trying to tell me, but if I don't finish this, I'm not going to give you the attention you deserve, and I don't want to do that to you. So give me 5 more minutes so that I can give you all the attention that what you're about to tell me merits, so that you don't feel as though I don't care about what you're about to say.
Yeah, and I'll tell you why I do this, because Number one, there's an open door, so they can come in my office anytime, plop in the city. Whether it's to talk about their feet hurt, what they did that weekend, whatever, it's open communication, so everything is not business.
Oh.
Okay?
Okay.
A lot of it is not business, okay? So if it's something and they have a customer, I know, but I have a customer on the line, that's gonna change everything. Then I try to listen a little bit, okay? Or no, it's not that important, is it important, is it really important? No, it's not that important, I'll come back, are you sure? You know, because it may be, because you gotta remember, we all have a chain of command. I may be responding to something that I'm on a timeline to the secretary, that has to go over to the governor.
Right.
So it kinda all depends on our business, on how our business is, you know, because your business may be a little bit different.
Sure.
Yours may be, you got someone hanging on a rope and you need to talk to someone now about whether that rope is gonna hold you on the ground. That's a little bit different.
Sure, I got you now.
Okay.
Okay.
So did you get your question answered that you had originally started with?
Well, what happened is, what I've just learned there is there are extenuating circumstances in everybody's time slot. And sometimes, even though you have the most well intentions of doing it, if there is such a proper way, this particular time may not have been represented the proper way, if I could say it that way. But there are some times when you might rush into me and want to tell me something, and that I can really stop what I'm doing. But there are some situations where that calls for not right now.
Yeah.
And I think also setting the standard for what the expectations are.
That's what it depends on the relationship.
Right, well, you know, because again, if I communicate with you ahead of time, hey, my door is open, come in any time. Like with one of my direct bosses, I know I can knock on his door, walk in his office. But I can also tell if he's on the computer, I just have a seat in his chair. And then I know when he's finished doing it, he'll turn, he'll look at me, and that's when I know he's ready for me to engage in a conversation. And you know, that's because I've known him for a long time, I know his communication style. So, you know, letting your employees know ahead of time, hey, if you're welcome to come in my office anytime you want, my door is always open. But keep in mind, if I'm working on something, you know, to your point, if it's a fire, yes, interrupt me. Otherwise, come on in, have a seat, and when I finish what I'm doing, I'm gonna look at you, and then you know you have my full attention, and let's get down into it. So letting them know, you know, establishing your communication style with your employees, letting them know how you work, allows them then to adapt and go, okay, if I walk in and he's in the middle of something, I know not to interrupt unless it's a fire. And he's gonna know I'm not gonna say, hey, I need to talk to you, unless it's an emergency. So when I do that, then you know, without having to ask, that it's an emergency and I need to give you my attention. So, you know, again, you know,
You also learn you learn how your
and their
employees' body
communication
language
styles,
too.
right.
Yeah.
And you'll be able, you know, sometimes you'll be able to tell when they walk in, you know. I don't even have to ask, I can tell, let me just stop what I'm doing, what's going on.
Gotcha.
Good conversation, guys. I like that. I don't like always being the one that just stands up here and talks at people. It's not very fun. So I threw out the 24-hour rule. Seemed like there's a little kickback. So learn yourself.
Yes,
You're getting there though, right?
I'm working on it.
A minute at a time, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, you get there. So I wanted to just tell you guys a little bit. So I kind of talked about the language part of the brain, but I wanted to share a little bit with you, just some real quick, 3 parts of the brain and why some of these things happen the way they do. So if we look at the palm of our hand, so this is our brainstem. So this is the part that regulates our heart rate. It's called the reptilian brain because it's the oldest part of our brain. It was the first part of the brain to develop. So that's what's regulating our body, our system, all of that. Then we pull the thumb and we've got the limbic system. The limbic system part of our brain is what gives us our emotions, our feelings, those sorts of things. When we take the fingers over, this is our cortex part of our brain. So what's important about this, why am I even talking about this with communication? So we already know when we're hijacked, we're offline, we know our language part of our brain. So the why the cortex wraps around, because it gives us context, right? So if we're in the brainstem or we're in the limbic, we've got no context for what's going on. All we know is we're angry, we're upset, we're sad, we've got a heightened emotion. We're not really thinking about where we're at and what we're actually doing. So that's why the waiting game is a big part, because it allows for this to regulate back So we've got the context, we get the prefrontal cortex. There's a book that talks about when you're working with kids, I flip my lid. So we know their cortex is off. They've got a heightened emotion, they're not processing. So we want to give them some time to bring that cortex back online. And this applies to us as adults as well. We want to wait for the cortex to come back online so we've got some context. Otherwise, the communication, like you said, I can say whatever I want right now, and it's not going to make a difference. Because you're hijacked, I'm hijacked, we're not going to get anywhere. So when you do get into those places where you do get hijacked, or you notice the person you're talking to is hijacked or offline, validation's a big piece. Hey, it looks like you're really upset. Also acknowledging where you're at if you have the ability to access that, so it doesn't put you in a position of shaming or blaming or putting down or putting that on someone else. Because then when you come back to revisit, not only do you have the cortex online to give context, but then you've also got someone who, felt validated in the height of their hijack, so you can revisit it with better productivity. Does that make sense? Okay, that's my geek out part. I love that part of it. So, and a lot of times when you see people get hijacked over the same scenarios, even when we reflect on our own lives, a lot of times we can pull that back to other times in our lives. So when we don't have that cortex, we're going back to times when we have felt that same or similar emotion where we've been heightened. So that's a whole other day on a whole other topic, but know that that's kind of what's going on with the brain when someone's getting hijacked. Not only do they have their language part off, but then they're also not having context, and they're in that lower part of their brain, which is the first part of their brains to develop. Does that make sense? Okay. So, I have an experiment so you guys can kind of see this a little bit. And we talked a little bit about this in the context piece. Oh, it went offline? See, this is what happens in the brain. It goes offline. Then we just plug in the 24-hour relax.
We need to get a warmer screensaver though.
We're getting there. You just hang in with me for a minute.
Oh, we got one. Yeah, we got one.
Okay, so here's our little experiment. Hold on for a minute. Have patience while I get my IT rock in here. Okay, so I'm going to play some music, and I want you guys to just focus on the picture and what do you notice happening in you, okay? We're just going to do this for like 30 seconds or so. What did you guys notice when I changed the music?
Disruption.
Mm-hmm. Yeah? It seemed like when I first pulled the picture up, you guys were like, oh, wow, it's relaxing, tranquility, I think I heard. Then you heard the Jaws music. How did it change how you experienced the picture?
Maybe grateful I wasn't in the water.
Yeah? Yeah.
Focus changed. I no longer look at the hammock. I was looking at the water, like, okay, where's the fish?
Yeah. So that's kind of a big piece of the context. So when I talk about asking questions and I talk about the culture you want to create, and when people are maybe coming at you in a way that you want to throw up your defenses, or you're coming in a way people are throwing up defenses, know there's context. Like you were talking about, why are some days I'm like, I got to get out of the office. I don't got time for this talk right now. I'm wondering which music you have playing. because we've all got context in life that affects our lens of life and how we do. So not only that self-awareness piece, like you notice the heart, the kind of gasp, you notice the focus change to the water. How we move through life and how we can recognize that in ourselves changes how we communicate and interact. And the other piece that it gives us is also an ability to recognize that in others. So we can have some other context outside ourselves. So that's kind of all I've got for you guys today.
Something, Abby?
Yeah.
Music plays a big role in our life, period.
Mm-hmm.
Put the atmosphere. Certain music you just have, even in your background, helps you when you're stressed or working through busy projects, just having something.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
I listen to music when I'm working on the house.
Yeah. I use music when I'm cleaning.
What do you guys notice about your sense of smell? This is another interesting geeky fact that I like to know and talk about. Do you guys notice certain smells affect you certain ways?
Smells will trigger things.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So smells are processed differently in the brain. So they go straight to create that emotional response. So if you want someone all hyped up and you want an intense environment in your work environment, put a smell in there that does that. If you want something that's kind of calming, that people are going to be more relaxed at work, you'll have a better flow conversation, change the smell. Notice, because it's processed much quicker in the brain and can change the mood much quicker than any other sensory.
Work with a bunch of guys that don't work.
He's like some fire up.
I work with that one guy who sense and like strong sense in general, just I can't do anything because it bothers me.
Yeah.
It's just, it's overwhelming.
Yeah. You've got to pay attention to that too. I find most people that have like a sensitivity to smell, like almost like allergic, like they'll get nauseous or headaches. If you do like essential oil that don't have a lot of chemicals in it, the response tends to be better. Can't guarantee that, not a doctor, but that's what I tend to find. If it doesn't have a lot of the chemicals in it, it's truly the smell. A lot of times you won't have those similar responses. So, yeah, any questions or anything?
Good job.
Thanks, guys.